Yes, we are. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Mass Farm to School webinar on pollination and pollinating gardens. My name is Dinah Mack. I am the Education Program Manager with Massachusetts Farm to School, and welcome everyone who is here. I'm very excited for this webinar, probably selfishly excited. It's a pollination and pollinator gardens is a big interest of mine, and I'm just so excited to learn from Eliza Lawrence, who is the School Gardens Coordinator with the Regional Environmental Council in Worcester. And Eliza will be presenting today. If you have any questions during the presentation, the chat is enabled, and so is the Q&A. But if you want to throw them in the chat, I will let Eliza know. And Eliza, maybe you can read the chat too while I'm running the slide deck.
Sounds great.
And if you are here, in a few days, you'll get an email saying thanks, and you'll get this presentation. And also there's a note sheet that Eliza will put in the chat as well, and you'll have access to that and also this recording to share and to use for future. And for those of you who are not familiar with Mass Farm to School, we have programs such as this throughout the year. Um, all of them are no cost. Most of them are virtual. And we'd love to have you. You'll always get the recordings, and you'll always get any information from us if you register and you can't make it that time. So please look at our calendar and stay in touch with us. All right, Eliza, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Dana. So I'm Eliza. I'm the School Gardens Coordinator at the Regional Environmental Council in Worcester. And we're going to talk all things pollinator gardens, but specifically pollinator gardens at schools and how they can enhance our school gardens, with some resources and how we can incorporate them into some lesson plans and start them with our students. Um, Next slide. So, a little overview about the REC, the Regional Environmental Council. Our mission is to bring people together to create a just food system and to build healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities in Worcester and beyond. We do that through three programs. So, the program I work for, which is where school gardens and community gardens are nestled under, is UGROW. It stands for Urban Growing Resources of Worcester. And we are made up of 80, almost 80 school and community gardens total throughout the city. So 38 of those are at schools, and the rest are community gardens or located at housing developments and institutions for clients and things like that. So the school gardens, like I said, we have 38 of them from pre-K all the way to high school. Um, then we have our farmers markets. We make 16 stops throughout the city. We have a mobile market van, and we also have two standing markets as well. And our youth grow program. So we have an urban farm in the city. It's a 3/4 of an acre farm, and we hire teens to work on the farm. We have about 40 teens that work every year, and they help us out at our school gardens, and a lot of our schools will take field trips to our urban farm as well. Next slide. So the goal of our school gardens program is to increase access to and use of garden spaces and garden-related education for students and educators and families. Schools can really, especially in Worcester, where a lot of people live in apartment buildings and the soil is not great, it's full of lead. Schools can really be sort of like an equalizer for those who don't have access to land. It's not life changing. It's like a couple of raised beds sometimes, but it's enough to use as an educational tool. And students do get to learn a lot of hands-on stuff. Some of our school gardens are bigger than others, but I mean, I think it's life changing. This is my work, but you know what I mean. No one is like subsisting off of our school gardens most of the time, but they're a great educational tool. Next slide. Yeah, so we do provide, we build the beds, we provide plants. The City of Worcester coordinates compost delivery. So if you're registered in our network, they deliver free city compost each year. We supply tools, and then we offer in and out of classroom workshops and field trips and after school clubs. I've been in this role for about 10 years, and I think when I started, there were 19 schools, and now we have 38 schools. So it's really exciting to see this program grow so much over the years. Next slide. So we specifically do a lot of work with farm to early childhood. So we have a lot of gardens at pre-K sites. Um, I kind of said this information already, but we do classroom and garden-based programs in and after school and then farm field trips. The next slide, I think, is just some cute photos, and then we can go on to what this is really about. I love these photos. Okay, so a few years ago, I think during the pandemic, we started, especially as a lot of schools were not in use, we started thinking about what we could add to our schools so that things were just growing there year round. We were just beginning to think about adding pollinator gardens, and then we were connected with the Worcester Native Plant Initiative, who was already doing this really important work throughout the city. Nikki, who has the in the left photo long brown hair there, she also owns a native plant nursery called Lady Fern Farm in Worcester. Um, they sort of connected with us and started teaching us about how to plant native pollinators and native plant gardens. And we thought, let's bring these to all of our schools because why not? So we learned quite a few things. If you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so this came from sort of a genuine need to expand what we offer to be less summer focused. So if you work in school gardens, you know that, especially in Massachusetts, the best part of the year to grow food is in the summer, and schools are not in session during the summer. So in our, eternal quest to figure out what we can plant to allow the kids to be able to grow and garden and see things growing year round, um, we thought a pollinator garden would be great for this. So that just came from a desire to want to grow more year-round things. So our summers are also really unpredictable. We don't know what they're going to be like. They could be really wet, they could be really dry, and native plants are pretty resilient. So whether or not there is someone there to water it, they're not going to die usually. Um, yeah, like I said, they don't need as much maintenance. Um, We've also sort of started expanding what we consider food. So when I started, we planted a lot of just tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and things that were pretty common seedlings, but were really summer heavy, grew in the summer. And it's really fun with kids, especially with kids from so many diverse backgrounds, to expand what we consider food. And in that, a lot of native plants have a lot of food-like things or are used as herbal remedies or things, and we don't always consider that um, as a part of the garden of things that we can harvest and we can eat. But kids love trying new things in the gardens. We've made, sun tea with the things we grow in our pollinator gardens. We can look at all of the plants, all of the parts of echinacea, talk about herbal remedies. A lot of kids, especially in Worcester, I mean, all of our families have folk remedies, right? So my grandmother used to, whenever she was from Italy, whenever she cleaned the house, she would cook onion and garlic and rosemary on the stove while she cleaned, and she said it brought, freshness to the air. And I think I later learned that some of those things are like antimicrobial, but I like learning about the different sort of folk and herbal remedies. And kids always have these things that they're, putting onions in their shoes when they're sick, or they always have things that their families say are good for them. So I like bringing that and incorporating that into the conversation. um, Also, climate change has a lot of unexpected impacts, and I think planting things that aren't really vulnerable to a change in climate are really good for kids to see that they're growing up in this changing climate, and there's a lot of things that we can do and we can plant that still give us sustenance, but might not die if we have like a really wet season or a really dry season. Um, it's a great way to attract pollinators and to teach about the life cycle and about habitat. We teach a lot about monarch butterflies and their relationship to milkweed, and every kid loves monarch butterflies, and they all learn to grow them in school. And there's always like some unit about monarch butterflies. And then also just climate resilient gardening in small spaces. So especially in Worcester, a lot of our spaces are small, a lot of our gardens are small, but what can we do in the small space that we have? We don't need to own a home or have a yard, but we can really do a lot with a little space. So even if that means a window garden or a school garden or a median or a little backyard porch, Whatever you have, you can do something with it, and I think kids are really happy to hear that because we don't all have huge yards. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So this is something that we put at our school gardens. This is like our draft, but this is on a big metal sign usually, and it's in Spanish and English, and it might be hard to sort of read the bottom of it depending on how close you are, but um, we always put an educational sign at all of our pollinator gardens just so people know that it's there, especially in the fall when it looks a little shaggy, just so people don't cut it down. So this says pollination is the process that allows plants to reproduce. This happens when pollen is transferred from one plant to another by wind, rain, or pollinator species such as bees, bats, hummingbirds, moths, and butterflies. Pollinator gardens are planted to attract pollinator species by providing food and shelter. Having pollinators near your garden helps to increase your garden's productivity. And then this fun fact that we love, which is that the shape and color of a flower will change which pollinators will visit. I have some more details on that with a cool book that we read to the kids about how flowers sort of communicate their color with different plants and animals, and they love learning about that. But um, when we plant pollinator gardens, I I'm pretty broad with how we do it. So we have native plants and non-native plants. Our native plants can be a lot more resilient and winter tolerant and increase the habitat for a lot of our bee species that are going extinct. But because they're educational gardens, and I'm not super strict on like what we plant there. So we always include native plants, but not all of our plants are native. And echinacea, coneflower, that's not native to this area, but we still plant it because it's a pretty flower. And um, people have, people have different opinions on that, and it can get kind of heated, but I like to say we have a good mix of things in our gardens. Um, so we can go to the next slide. So these next few slides are kind of just talking about native and invasive plants. This information is all from Worcester Native Plant Initiative, and I owe them a lot. They taught me a lot about native plants, but you all might know, but this is sort of something that we teach our students when we're talking about native plants. But native plants are the species that are naturally found in your region that have co-evolved with the native wildlife over the course of thousands of years, and the two depend on each other for survival. In North America, a plant is often deemed native to a specific region if it was present before colonization. Um, our native plants here in Worcester, are native and all over Massachusetts. A lot of them are native to Massachusetts and some to New York because obviously borders are man-made and plants don't follow those rules. So when we teach about pollination, I like to just remind people that, the area is general. They don't just stay in Massachusetts or just in New Hampshire or just in New York. They spread. You can go to the next slide. So, invasive plants, so there's a difference here, not just non-native plants, because there's a lot of pretty non-native plants that we can put in our gardens that aren't invasive, but then there are invasive plants. Um, so the U.S. Forestry Service defines invasive as either non-native or whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm and harm to human health. So we have a lot of plant and animal species in Massachusetts that fit that bill. This is one of those plants. If anyone recognizes it, it's called Phragmites, and you see the fluffy seed heads in the fall and winter everywhere. This was used as packaging materials on ships from Europe over 400 years ago. And when they docked, they would unpack crates and toss the packing fluff off the boats and everywhere. And now it's growing all over our waterways. Um, and that kind of becomes a problem when you think about the species of insects and things that can survive. So the whole ecosystem off of a certain plant. So in Europe, 170 species of insects eat Phragmites. So it's fine and it's great there. And in the US, only 5 species of insects eat Phragmites, but it's growing all over the place. So those 5 species have a lot to eat, but all the other ones that would have eaten the native plants that the Phragmites took over do not eat it and have nothing to eat. So we would need about 1,000 more years for it to potentially adapt like a native plant, and for other species to co-evolve and start utilizing it. And in the meantime, it continues to sort of outcompete other wetland plants in a variety of settings in saltwater and freshwater and urban. Um, and this plant also has very few natural predators. So when we talk about invasive plants, sorry, I'm doing a lot of talking. When we talk about invasive plants, we just like to think about like what makes it invasive and why is that harmful to our species, that have a habitat here in Massachusetts. Um, you can go to the next slide. This is another example that I feel like I've heard a lot about it lately because people have started to say like pick it so you can eat it and make pesto out of it. And I don't think it tastes very good, but you should pick this if you see it in the woods. In the 1860s, it was brought to the US as a culinary herb, and it has escaped into the wild and begun to take over the understory of forests, and it controls access to light and water and nutrient sources of other plants that grow in the understory. And researchers have found that it is allelopathic, so meaning it releases chemicals that hinder the growth of other plants. Um, some researchers also think that these compounds affect the beneficial relationships that plant species have with soil fungi, but it does hinder the growth of a lot of other plants in the understory. So um, this is just another example of an invasive species, and why we want to plant some native species in our gardens and teach kids about it. Um, Next slide. So when we think of the coevolution of plants and insects, I feel like at the REC always teach about monarch butterflies and about milkweed. Um, Milkweed in recent years has been uh, it's a very popular plant. It grows really easily, but people don't like the way it spreads and it's not that pretty and it only flowers for so long. So people kind of like pull it out of their yard when they see it, or they think of it as sort of like an ugly thing. We try to keep as much of it as we can in the garden, but yeah, we've all heard of the declining monarch populations, and we don't really see as many as we used to. Plants can sort of tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions, and that's why many plants from other places can successfully live here, and why we can take plants from our region and plant them elsewhere, and they can do kind of okay. But insects tend to be specialists, so they feed on and pollinate a very narrow spectrum of plant life, sometimes just a single species. So monarch butterflies are a great example of this. They live their entire life cycle on milkweed. They lay their babies there. Their babies drink the sap from the milkweed. 90% of insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. So it's not easy for us to just say, oh, well, they'll adapt and they'll begin to co-evolve. Like it takes thousands and thousands of years, and in the meantime, a plant or animal may go extinct. I'm just going to get a sip of water for a second. All right, we can go to the next slide. Um, these are different types of milkweed on the left. I love milkweed. I think it's beautiful. We like to plant the orange kind a lot, but I think it's all really cool. And the seed pods are really cool in the fall. We love looking at them with the kids. They're really silky. You can kind of like take them and put them in your hand and blow them around like a dandelion. Um, and this is the caterpillar from a monarch butterfly. So monarchs did co-evolve with milkweed, and as they did, the butterflies developed an adaptation that allows their caterpillars to feed on the plant, and many insects cannot feed on milkweed. So the sap, I don't know if you've ever like broken off a leaf and seen the milky sap. It feels like glue. It's latex-based sap. Um, and it contains a lot of toxic compounds that most other insects can't digest. It'll kill them, um, but monarch caterpillars absorb the toxins as they feed on the leaves, and then they become poisonous to potential predators. So the toxins that are found in a monarch butterfly host protect the caterpillars and the adult butterflies from birds and other predators. So um, yeah, these are an example of a specialist species. So we can go to the next slide. This fact is crazy. This is a book by Doug Tallamy up here, The Nature of Oaks. But just to sort of talk about, again, native plants, oak trees, which are a native species to Massachusetts, can support over 500 species of caterpillars. And ginkgo, which is beautiful. I love ginkgo trees. I have like a list in my phone of my dream garden that I'll have one day when I own a home, knock on wood. And I have many things. Ginkgo is one of them, but I always have to keep in mind, like, okay, if you plant a ginkgo tree, you should also plant an oak tree near it. Um, because a ginkgo tree only hosts 5 species of caterpillars. Um, and if you go to the next slide, it one brood of chickadees requires 6 to 9,000 caterpillars before it leaves its nest, and the parents forage within a 150-foot radius only of the nest, and the babies are only in the nest for 12 to 16 days. So when you think about you know, one brood of chickadees requiring 6 to 9,000 caterpillars, and you only have ginkgo trees around, and they only host 5 species of caterpillars, and may only be a couple caterpillars on the tree, versus an oak tree that hosts 500 species of caterpillars, um, and that chickadee isn't flying very far. You can start to see how this moves up the food chain and how different animals are affected by what is planted within even a 150-foot radius of a nest. Um, Next slide. Um, so yeah, one other great thing about native plants is talking about uh, the rising temperatures or climate change with your students, and about um, how plants trap and store carbon. So you can see here that a lot of our native plants have developed really deep tap roots. They help with stormwater runoff. They help, a lot of native plants are used in rain gardens. And then some non-native plants like daylilies, which are beautiful, but their tap roots just don't go as deep. And these roots really trap and store carbon, and the bigger the roots, the harder it is for them to get pulled during like a hurricane or a windstorm. So the better it is for our soils, the less erosion happens, the more carbon gets trapped. But I want to reiterate here that native means something different everywhere you go. So in some places, coconuts are native and tamarind and mangoes. And I don't want to shame non-native plants either, because I'm a huge fan of mangoes and coconuts and I love those things. So some people are really hardcore when it comes to this stuff. And I always say you should just have a healthy mix of both. So we always try to do a 70-30 rule where we do, 70% native plants, but then we also plant things that are just kind of fun to have in our garden. So we'll plant, we'll put a pot of lemon balm out because lemon balm smells really good, even if it's not native. Or um, we will have some daylilies in our pollinator garden just because they're a pretty flower and the kids like them. So um, as long as the non-native plants aren't like super invasive and taking over everything in your garden, like mint, I feel like we've all had maybe a situation, depending on who's in the room here, but where you planted mint and it's just like outgrown everything around you. So um, plant both the ginkgo and the oak, and I think we're good. Um, Next slide. So, how to design a pollinator garden with your students. So, this is a pollinator garden on the left that's at one of our schools at North High. And you can see like there's some things in this garden, like we planted a bunch of rhubarb because we had it. And um, I think I'm standing next to some lemon balm over there. But we have bee balm, we have aster, we do have some echinacea that I'm next to too, but we always have like a couple of rules for our pollinator gardens. So we incorporate native plants. We do the 70-30 rule. We leave something for the animals and something for the humans. So we plant some flowers that are pretty for us to look at, but maybe we don't have a use for, and those are just for the animals. And then we plant some things like bee balm, which is great for both humans and animals. It's wild bergamot, and it tastes really good in tea, and we can harvest it and we can sprinkle it as an herb, but it's also really good for the birds. And then we plant something like I think we use a lot of like catnip or catmint in our gardens as well, because the kids love learning, like taking it home and trying to feed it to their cats if they have them, but it's not necessarily native, and I don't even know if it's a pollinator. I see a lot of bees around it, but it's just like a fun herb to have in our garden. Same thing with like sage and thyme, and we put a lot of our herbs in our pollinator gardens as well. So that there's something for the animals and something for the humans. A really important thing to think about is when does your stuff bloom? So, especially over the winter when our bees don't have a lot to feed on, when they emerge in the spring, we want to give them like a really quick and easy sort of source of nectar and pollen. And so we want to make sure we have things blooming from April all the way to October. And those side months are really important. A lot of our things bloom in the summer, so usually June to August is really safe. Like you're going to have a lot of things in your garden blooming, but you want to make sure you have a couple things in the beginning of the season and a couple things in the end of the season. Um, the end of the season so that you can sustain those bees and those animals and plants, animals and insects over the winter, and then again in early spring so that they have something to feed on when they're sort of emerging again. Um, Also, the color and the shape of plants. We want a diverse array of colors and shapes, as all pollinators are attracted to different colors and have different shaped tongues and um, noses and what is it called? Proboscis, that they feast on nectar and pollen with. So we want to, I have this great book here actually called Flower Talk that we read to our students, and it's how plants use color to communicate. And it kind of goes through each color and who's attracted to it and what else they need. So I think here, white talks to moths and bats, and um, let's see, bees are attracted to purple and yellow, and um, green isn't talking to anyone. And it talks about the shape of a plant and like how bees need something to land on. So I think that's kind of fun for our kids to look up. Like, okay, well, do we have things from April to October in our garden? What's blooming when? And is there a diverse array of colors? And who's landing? Who's able to come to our garden? Is it just for bees? Is it just for bats? Um, and then where is our garden growing? So you get a bunch of native plants, and you're putting them in your pollinator garden, and some of them need a ton of water, and some of them are good in dry conditions. So you want to think about the sunlight, the how much sunlight they need. Some of them are good in the shade, some of them are good in the sun. How much rain they need or how much water they need, and then the height of plants. So if you're putting your plants like here, we have a lot of our, you can kind of see in this photo, in the front is a lot of stuff low to the ground that's going to spread and stay low to the ground so that we can see the things in the back. I think it's like Joe Pye weed that grows like 6 feet tall. So you wouldn't want to put that right in the front of your garden, and then you couldn't appreciate or enjoy anything in the back of your garden. I mean, your insects would still enjoy everything in your garden if you did that, but you wouldn't be able to see it. So when you're designing your pollinator garden, think about where you're putting things and what elements they need. Do they need a lot of shade? Will one thing shade the other one out? Stuff like that. There's a lot of great resources. So I am trying to think, maybe I was going to open one of these, but there's a lot of really awesome resources that sort of like tools for how you can find what those pollinator plants need. So let me, um, Dinah, do you care if if I share my screen?
Oh, sure. Hold on one sec. Let me
Okay.
stop sharing this.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Can everyone see that? Okay, so this is the resources that I'm gonna give out at the end of the slideshow, but we use this plant finder tool, which I think is really cool. If you're doing the research with your students or friends and you want to look for what grows in your area, um, this is really awesome. So say you have a really rainy area of your school you want to put a garden, or it's really dry and you know no one's going to get to it. You can look up plants by the soil moisture. You can look them up by the ecoregion. In Worcester, we're like so on the verge of two. So I usually click both of these for that area, both northeastern highlands and northeastern coastal. How much sun are they going to get? And this is cultivation status is so if you have, for instance, you have bee balm, which is Monarda fistulosa. Fistulosa is the Latin name for it. A cultivar might be like Sunset Breeze bee balm, and it's like a totally different cultivar. We try to sort of avoid those in our pollinator gardens because those have been like bred and adapted to be beautiful colors, but might not carry a lot of like nectar or pollen, and they might not be native. So we try to avoid the cultivars. Yeah, here, if you what wildlife do you want to attract? What tolerance? So, is it an urban environment? We have like so much salt runoff in our urban environment. So, what is salt tolerant? And then over here. So, this is like a really fun thing to sort of play around with. That one is the plant finder tool. And then this is really great. This is Geiger Lab at UMass Dartmouth. This is about pollinator species that are specifically at risk. So if you go to this one, I'm gonna try to, um, it is hard to see here, but you can see basically the Latin name, the common name, the plant type. So is it an herb, or is it a shrub, is it a tree? That's really good. Like you might look at this list and look at a lot of things that bloom from March all the way to October, and it might be all trees. And you're like, I actually don't want to make a pollinator garden that's just full of trees. I want some herbs. Um, the sun requirements, the soil requirements, and when they bloom. And this is super helpful. So this is March all the way to October. These are the at-risk species of bumblebees. So which species of bumblebees are they helping out? And then other bees. And the blue one is for butterflies. And up at the top, it tells you a little bit about the at-risk species and where. So if you're planting above, 1,000 feet sea level, select plants for all three. If you're planting below it, use these two, and there's the Latin names there. So that's really cool. There's a lot of resources like this online, and I have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven tools that I'm going to send out that I think are just fun to sort of poke around with. There's a Mass Audubon plant list. There's Lady Fern Farm, which is in Worcester. They have a plant list. So there's a lot of like fun research you can do with your students and or your colleagues when you're planting, um, when you're in the works, like when you're doing all the research to plant your pollinator garden. Um, if you want to share the slideshow again, we can go back to that. This is another reason why you don't want to just like go on a website and click and order a pack of seeds that say like wild seeds or pollinators and you don't know where you're ordering it from, because it might be like native wild seeds in California and you're ordering it from California and it comes here and none of those are naturalized and they don't really work the same way. And I feel like there's a lot of that out there. Like you can find a lot of just like general wildflower seeds. And it's cool to actually like think about what you're planting and do the research. Um, yeah, there's a lot of really great nurseries in Massachusetts too, and I have some of those listed. I think um, I have for the western part of the state. I talked about Wing and a Prayer Nursery. That's a nursery in Cummington. Dinah and I were just talking about it. That's where she got her native pollinator plants, and they're so wonderful there. But she also, I'm pretty sure I heard this. This is a rumor, but we'll do field trips. So if you're in Western Mass and you want to, it's a wonderful place. It really is. If you want to take your students there, I think she does. She would entertain that idea, but she's wonderful and a wealth of knowledge. And then in Worcester and Central Mass, we have Lady Fern Farm. And then in Eastern Mass, I know of City Natives, which is in Mattapan. I think it's part of the trustees, but they grow a lot of really great things too. So also, going out and supporting, I think supporting local growers is really awesome. There's a lot of big nurseries that also sell native plants and sell good plants to use, but I like going to the little guy sometimes. I think it's really special. You can also save seeds. So if you know anyone that has a pollinator garden or has some of the plants that you want and you like in the fall, ask them for some seed heads, you can plant the seeds with your students as well. So we'll talk about that in a second, but you can go to the next slide. So this is an important distinction when we're talking about pollen and nectar. So this is just like a really simple way of remembering what pollen and what nectar does. So pollen sources from native plants are critical because they enable bees to make more bees. Nectar sources provide fuel for adult bees and butterflies to be active, and host plants give caterpillars, the larval stage of an insect, something to eat. So um, when you look at the list, a lot of them will say like nectar, pollen, and host plant, and that's kind of what this means. We tend to think of bees as like bumblebees, so we talk a lot about bees, I feel like, and saving the bees. And I feel like we always think about bumblebees when we think of that, or honeybees. But those are actually not native. A lot of our honeybees are and our honeybees are not native, so they're not as good at spreading pollen or collecting nectar as some of our native bees are. They actually require a lot more nectar and a lot more pollen um, to make honey, and they often take honey. No, I'm not knocking anyone that has honeybees. My dad has honeybees, and I think that they're great, and I love honey. But there's also a lot of other bee species that are really important. That some of them don't even live in hives. Some of them are ground nesting bees, which is why you always hear in the fall for like leave the leaves and save the leaves, and why people talk about not clearing your pollinator garden or your perennials like right away at the end of the season, but letting them overwinter because a lot of bee species, lay their larvae in the old stalks. So um, it is a beautiful photograph. Therefore, yeah, including plants that provide all three functions to as many species as possible, so nectar and pollen and a host, throughout the season is critical for developing sort of an effective conservation plan for native pollination systems. Um, it's really cool in Worcester as we have 38 gardens, as I said, at school gardens, and we've started to put pollinator gardens at all of them. So I think we're at 22 maybe that have pollinator gardens, and it's cool for the kids to know about the pollinator garden at their own school, but also know that this is an effort across the city um, that makes it so our city in general is just more hospitable to pollinators. And I think it's really cool, even though we only have like a couple little gardens here and there, it's making like a little network for these species to come back and live here. Um, you can go to the next slide. This is an example. This is right across from a school, Lady Fern Farm and Worcester Plant Initiative did this. This is like just to show like when you plant a lot of your native species, they don't look good. Like they kind of look like, all right, like they're small, maybe they're a little if you plant them at the end of the season, there's like a little stump, like it doesn't look that good. This was just an example of like one season later. So we planted this is on the left in the fall, and in the spring of next year, in the summer of next year, this is what the garden looked like. So I always say, like, don't give up. You plant them when they're small and they'll look really good the next year. Um, you can go to the next slide. This is like a little sample list. So I included this on our resource list as well, but this is some of the stuff I like to plant in the garden. This is a mix of native and non-native. It's a mix of things that grow all the way from April to October. Um, And I like this as like a mix of things that you can eat and not eat. So we have wild bergamot, we have anise hyssop, we have broadleaf mountain mint, um, yarrow, things that can be used sort of like in teas or as herbs. And then we have things like cardinal flower and milkweed and false indigo and aster that are for the birds, for the bees. So um, again, like I said, coneflower isn't native, but we like the look of it. I said this already, but in some of our gardens where we have raised beds, this is also where we add things like sage and thyme and rhubarb and other perennial herbs and things that might not be native, but um, we still like to eat. And I made this note to try and do like lemon balm and mint in containers because they spread like crazy. Although we've put some lemon balm in our pollinator gardens and it's been fine. You can go to the next slide. So this is So sowing seeds with students is a really great way to start your pollinator garden. It's awesome for all ages, truly, and it's a great thing to do in the winter when we're inside more. So January to February is a really great time to start your native plants. So I have lesson plans in this resource guide that I can go through really quickly. But with the younger grades, we like to do seed eggs. We used to call them seed bombs, but like bombs aren't a super chill thing to talk about in schools. And we used to call them seed, so then we switched to seed balls, and all kids think, well, older kids think balls are a funny word. So we've changed it now to seed eggs, and we actually put them in little egg cartons. And how you do this is you take 2 parts clay and 1 part soil on a plate, and we use for our clay unscented kitty litter. It sounds weird, but it is way easier to use than like a slab of clay where you're having to like scoop your hand off of it. And we can put it on but make sure it's unscented. Unscented, just natural minerals and clay. So clay, kitty litter, and soil. And we have the kids spray it with a water bottle and make the little balls out of it. And they push an indent with their thumb. They can sprinkle the seeds inside. They can roll it back up, and then they can put it outside immediately, or they can save it for when they want to put it outside. And on the right, we have the milk jug method, which is what we do with our older students. Where we cut a milk jug, we take off the top, we cut a milk jug, we fill it with soil, we very lightly sow our winter seeds, we tape it back up. You have to drill holes in the bottom as well. You can stick a pen in there though, you can use a drill. Put the soil in, you tape it up, you write what you grew because you're not going to remember in the spring, I guarantee you that. And then you can just set those jugs right outside. So a lot of our native plants need a cold stratification period, which is just where they're in the cold for a certain amount of time before they emerge in the spring. And you can kind of cheat cold stratification. A lot of people will cheat it by like putting some seeds in their fridge for a while, but it's really easy just to fill a jug with these seeds, and it's awesome. It's fun for the kids to see and just set them and forget them. So you can take them outside in January or February, and you can leave them until spring, and they can track the growth of it. Um, they don't need like a whole lot of water in the winter, but come spring, if it's not raining a lot, you can water them a little bit. And then when they're about like an inch or two, like the size of like the top part of your finger, that's when they can scoop them out and plant them. So we usually let them get kind of big before we do that. We don't want to kill them off, but we also supplement whole plants from a nursery, and we use our pollinator gardens to also put in spring bulbs when we get them donated, and that's another way to sort of teach about early sources of nectar and pollen. But I did include like a resource. What is it? Our seed eggs workshop, which we usually do between pre-K and third grade, and then our winter sow workshop as well, which came from Lady Fern Farm, and we usually do that with grades 4 and up, just because if we're drilling holes in the jugs and we're cutting them with scissors, it's like a little more tricky. Um, and we also always pair this with a book. So with our younger kids, we love the book called I Am a Bee. I don't have that book on me. We also have the honeybee. There's like so many pollinator and bee related books out there. But I showed this book already, but this is the book we always use with our older kids, The Flower Talk. They love it. I love it. I think it's such a clever book. Um, and then there's also, I attached a lesson that goes with the Flower Talk book. So it's a whole lesson based on this book. There's like pre-reading discussion questions, post-reading discussion questions, um, creating a flower activity, and then it also has some really fun photos. Actually, Dinah, can I share my screen again? Um, all right. This is the lesson plan. It comes from the Bee Cause Project, but it's all about this book. Um, it talks about the science standards, but these photos I think are so cool. Like this hummingbird moth, that's its tongue right there. So you can really see like what shape a plant needs. This is a bee tongue. here, a flower fly, a hummingbird. I just love the visuals. I think they're so good. And here's all the terms defined as well. So that will be on the resource list I'll share out. That's I showed it before, but it has the link to the slideshow, the workshops, the seed eggs workshop, and the winter sow in jugs workshop, some local nurseries and mass, tools that you can use to find plants with students. The plant finder tool I showed you, the pollinator species at risk, there's tons of resources out there, and then some books that we love. This is the lesson plan here. Just some notes on things to keep in mind when planting a pollinator garden, and then a sample plant list for things that we kind of put in every one um, of our pollinator gardens at schools. You can um, go back to the slideshow. I think this is about it. Yeah. Like I said, winter is a really good time to start seeds with students, and it's a great way to start thinking about the garden again. And that's it. That's what I have. So, thanks. That's my email. If you have any questions, Eliza at recworcester.org. This is some aster, some native aster on this slideshow, the flowers, and those are blooming right now. If you live around any aster, it's like so fun in October to see like a bright purple flower. I love that one. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eliza. We have a few minutes for some questions if anyone wants to throw a question in the chat or some feedback for Eliza or anything you want to share. You could even tell Eliza what brought you to the webinar today.
Or where you're coming from and your favorite pollinator plant.